one of the elements of the SNAP community is that we're aiming to inform what's happening in England based on sort of best practice from around the world. And at both levels, globally and in the UK, we know that biodiversity is declining and we're in real trouble. If you look at what's happening just in the UK, in terms of national goals related to the environment that we're aiming to use to address this biodiversity loss, there's a whole set of different things there. And as that little confused lapwing shows, there are lots of different policies, lots of different activities, which sometimes contradict and certainly need to be managed in a way that accounts for all these different constraints. And this is why we think systematic conservation planning can play a really major role in informing decision-making in England. So just to give some background, so this is described as an operational model for identifying and implementing the management of priority conservation areas, or more broadly for nature recovery and ecological restoration. So it's designed to be efficient, repeatable, transparent, and equitable. And it's the most widely used approach in the world. It's seen as the gold standard for integrating all those different stakeholder values, biodiversity and socioeconomic data to identify where best to focus our efforts. And there are various versions of this acronym of CARE, but this is the one that I like best, which is that as part of this, we are aiming to produce effective ecological networks that are connected, which is fairly self-explanatory, adequate to make sure that we've got enough of everything, enough of each conservation feature to ensure its long-term persistence. We want it to be representative. So we want every aspect of biodiversity to be represented in our networks of areas that we're managing for nature recovery. And also we want it to be efficient. We recognise that conservation nature is only one land use, and yeah, we need to account for all the other land uses and sea uses when we're making these plans. So this broad approach of systematic conservation planning, there's a set of steps that are widely recognised that can be grouped into framing, spatial conservation prioritisation, and implementation. So framing is bringing everyone together and working out what what we're trying to achieve, coming up with broad objectives and then starting to turn them into more specific elements. And then the spatial conservation prioritisation approach, which is the one that a lot of research is done on, is the methods for identifying where are the best places for meeting those goals. And then implementation is the final stages. And to illustrate the spatial prioritisation element in a bit more detail, that often involves defining your planning region, identifying your conservation features, so your important elements that you want represented in your network of sites. That could be species, habitats, ecosystem services, important historical sites, culturally important sites, a whole range of things. If you can map it, then you can include it in the analysis. Then you divide your region up into different planning units, measure the amount of each of those features in each planning unit, come up with a cost metric. So for each planning unit, say what the cost would be of conserving that, and that could be the direct cost of managing, or it could be the opportunity cost, the amount of money that would be lost to agriculture or house building or whatever are the competing land uses. You identify your existing sets of conservation areas and also areas that aren't suitable, set targets for each one of your features, and then use software to identify the best places for meeting the targets at the minimum cost while achieving connectivity. And more broadly, this approach of systematic conservation planning, it isn't just the sort of technical element that's so important. It's a way of, as an organisation, as a community, working out what's important and bringing people together to discuss that. So this great paper by Bottrell et al. From 2012 for a set of organizations in the US and Mexico showed all the different ways that having this sort of joint vision, shared vision that could then be used to identify and inform action on the ground, has all sorts of benefits in terms of fundraising, sharing data and sharing vision, building pride. So yeah, it is far more than the technical element. And recently, DICE was awarded a large grant from Research England's Expanding Excellence in England, building on our strengths in this field to build England's capacity for research related to area-based conservation. The project's called Sharing Space for Nature. And a key part of that was based around the idea that while systematic conservation planning is proven globally, its uptake in England until recently has been limited. So we felt it was really important to break down all the silos. These are something I presented last year with a Kentish silo of a nest house, showing all the different sorts of groups who are involved in spatial planning or who need spatial plans to inform their work. And at the moment, there are definitely silos between those groups. So that's why we came up with the Spatial Nature Planning, SNAP community. So this is a community of practice for those based in England and involved with conservation planning in the UK and internationally. And it aims to foster the exchange of experiences and expertise to help systematic conservation planning meaningfully support relevant policy and practice in the country. And a key part of that is these annual SNAP forums. So as I said, this is the second forum. The project, our Sharing Space for Nature project, is 5 years long. So we will, at the very least, have 3 more of these in the coming years. And yeah, we had a great forum last year, which is all written up in the report that you can see there. And yes, that summary support is up on our website shared with the attendees. And as part of it, we identified the priority actions that came out of the discussions from last year. And the key thing is we started between us sort of moving forward to help address some of those, but we really would welcome support from across the community to progress these. So I'll go through those in a little bit of detail next. But also just to show that, yes, this is the growth in the number of attendees. And as I said, yeah, one of the sort of silver linings of this event being on this year is that we've been able to have actually 30 more people. I think it's grown even more this year on top of the ones shown in that graph. So you can see there's still a strong academic focus, and we're really keen to involve the wider community as well. But it's brilliant that we have got people from the NGO sector, public sector, and private sector also involved, because that's going to be key to really getting change and making sure that this community helps support change. So in terms of, yes, the priorities that came out of the meeting last year, so the first one was to come up with a steering committee, so who are shown there. So this is the group that are helping guide what we're doing going forward. Priority 2 is translating national targets into local actions. And yes, unfortunately, we were due, if we were meeting in person, to have a session on this tomorrow morning with Anne Plumtree from the KBA Secretariat and Jess Neal-Boss from DICE, talking about their work to look at how to translate national targets into local actions, and in particular, as a first step, looking at what types of species should we be seeing as priorities for spatial planning in England. So yes, we'll definitely be in touch more about this. I'm sure we can have online meetings to start progressing this. The third one, yes, was engagement and capacity in systematic conservation planning. So we've shared the outputs, but we're definitely, I mean, on the DICE side, we've got an amazing team, but we're sort of at capacity. So yeah, we know that there's a need to increase the visibility of SNAP in academic spaces, that we need to develop a lexicon of SCP language, update the website to showcase and worked examples and case studies, disseminate a newsletter, and create a step-by-step guide for how to effectively perform an SCP exercise. So we're in the process of doing some of those. Again, if you're interested in being involved, please get in touch because yeah, we'll be able to move much faster the more people that we have involved. And then finally, yes, one of the priorities that came out of last year was a focus on we need to improve data quality and access. So we need to improve the quality of the spatial data that we're using in these decisions. A big part of that is linked to priority 2 of identifying what are the important features that we need to map. And yes, but we've invited all the local biodiversity record centres to the forum, and it's great that some of them are attending today to have that, to get their involvement, because as we all know, data availability and data quality is a massive issue in England. Despite the incredible expertise and the amazing data sets there's definitely, I think, a need to look at how we can best inform spatial planning going forward. Right. That was a whistle-stop tour. Yes, I think the next step, just checking, is brilliant. So Pete Brotherton is here. So Pete, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, and to everyone, just say it's fantastic that Pete's joined us today. He is in a very sort of modest, slightly behind the scenes way, one of the most important people informing all the elements around nature recovery in England, played a big role in the Lawton Review and lots of things since. So we're delighted that Pete, in his role as Director of Science at Natural England, is able to give us the background to the sorts of things that we need to be helping inform in the future. So over to you, Pete.
So I've given a slightly expanded title to this, and firstly, it's brilliant to be here today, a real privilege, and I'm delighted to be part of that, the steering group for that wider project that Bob was just talking about. So it's very dear to my heart. I'm going to cover the policy and scientific context for spatial planning for nature in England, and I'm going to start by giving the slide. We'll move on. A bit of a gallop through some of the recent evolution of nature policy and legislation, and describe that shift that we've seen from nature protection to nature recovery, and the role that strategic planning, I think, is critical to that critically needs to play in that if that's going to succeed. I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of the newer and most relevant policies that will shape those decisions from a national and local government perspective. And talk about some of the incentives and approaches that are linked to that. And then I think it's really important not to forget what these changes need to add up to based on the science. So I'm going to end with some reflections on what all of that planning needs to do in terms of changing things. That little image in the corner there of climate shifts and so on is my reminder to just say that the spatial planning that we needs to do a whole range of things. I'm going to focus on nature. I will talk a bit about some of the other things that spatial planning needs to take account of, but it's really key that that the choices that we made for nature do at least not jar with what society also needs from the limited amount of land and increasingly feeling limited amount of sea space that we have. All space is contested in England and in the UK, and therefore how we make decisions around that contested space is really critical. And being cognizant of what others expect of that space is really key, because although everybody, I think between 70 and 80% of people say that they care about nature and would like more nature, what politicians are yet to be convinced of is that people vote because of their care for nature. And so all these other factors will remain really important drivers to decisions. Bob touched on this. You know this, don't you? So I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but I think it's a really important context to everything that we do. Starting from a very depleted state already post-war, we were probably already one of the most nature depleted nations. The last 50 years or so has seen us get even worse. So even today, after years of the Species Recovery Programme celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, the 35th anniversary, sorry, this year. We've been trying to recover nature for a while. We've been protecting nature for a long time, but we still see over 40% of UK species in decline, 25% of mammals threatened with extinction, 73 million fewer birds over the past 50 years. The biomass of pheasants and red-legged partridges that we release every year exceeds the biomass of all wild birds combined. And flying insects have probably declined significantly in the last 20 years. Data's still a bit patchy there. Earthworms have declined, and linked to that, or perhaps driving that, are all the habitat losses that we've documented well. Those last two statistics around species is a reminder that these losses aren't just sad, they're profoundly consequential to human economy, well-being, and health. These are signs that our food system are under pressure, and a real need for urgent action. And then finally, we need to be honest that the protections that we've put in place has probably prevented extinctions. We now know of nearly 500 species from fewer than 5 sites, and they've probably been successful in slowing declines. Triple SIs, for example, are a good thing. We know that they punch above their weight in terms of what they contribute, but we need urgent action to go beyond what we've got to recover nature. And that need, I think, is reflected in the shift that we've seen. So up until even as far as 2006, much of our policy framework was about protecting what's left and doing that a bit better. And that's given us a raft of protections that support species and their habitats, and a plethora of acronyms of special sites, often overlapping, that can help us at least stem the tide of loss. But we need to go better than that. And Bob mentioned this already, but I think that this report, led by John Lawton and an expert panel, which included four past or present members of the president of the British Ecological Society, a raft of really great people from a range of different sectors, delivered this report to the Secretary of State in 2010, and that really marked a sea change, or at least a big step up in ambitions around the recovery, and people finally getting that the problem wasn't simply that our sites weren't working. It was that the sites that we had simply weren't enough to do what we needed in terms of recovering nature and what society needed from its natural environment. And we saw this really rapid change. Papers have been written about, academic papers have been written about why that report had such a big effect quite so quickly. But just the following year, with the Natural Choice Securing the Value of Nature and Biodiversity 2020, we saw that report really reflected in that ambition around that policy direction that these important documents steered. In the following year, with the National Planning Policy Framework in 2012, we saw for the first time the commitment that the planning system should establish coherent ecological networks that are more resilient, etc. We also then see that carried forward into NPPF 2024, which goes beyond that. It reinforces the need to plan well for ecological networks and to protect ecological networks where they exist and ecological network components. It also begins to talk a lot more in public policy around the importance of accessible, connected and multifunctional and locally appropriate urban green infrastructure. And that locally appropriate, I think, also needs to extend into rural areas. NPPF also brings centre stage the importance of the planning system in supporting the transition to net zero and to address climate change adaptation through measures that tackle flood risk, heating, and so on. And then in the first environment 25-year environment plan, Our Green Future, back in 2018, again, we saw this explicit commitment to a nature recovery network that actually then goes back to name checking those recommendations. There were 23, if anyone's interested, around recovering nature with the more, bigger, better joined, a mantra that we've got used to. More recently, we've seen that, well, fairly hot on the heels of that, we saw strategic planning finally coming into law with the Environment Act creating legally binding targets for halting the decline of species abundance, reducing extinction risk, increasing area of habitat, alongside a range of other commitments that aren't legally binding, but nonetheless really shape what we're trying to achieve, not least the 30 by 30 criterion. And I'll come back a little to this later on. That Environment Act also set up local nature recovery strategies. It started the process in place to bring together local nature recovery strategies, which set out how we can deliver for nature, more or less on a county level. It's planning authority level, and I've just flagged what I think is really great about those is it also captures local aspirations. So it builds in why the places that matter and thinks about what people need in those places. And this, to me, I think is a really important resource for all of you interested in, all of us interested in strategic planning. It's the one I'm going to say least about because I know we're going to hear a lot about them later in the today, in this afternoon. I was about to say in the conference. Well, this is the conference, isn't it? And but I'm saying least because of that, not because I don't think they're important. I think they're a really critical resource for us to draw upon, and the process that was used to deliver them means that they have incredible credibility, and we need to really get behind those and think about how we can deliver them. And then two other three potentially other mechanisms were brought in: mandatory biodiversity net gain that we know all about, and clearly there's some work going on in what that will really deliver, but broadly pretty much all development now needs to deliver at least 10% extra for nature than it is causing the loss of. And protected site strategies and species conservation strategies provisions existed in this act as well, which zooms out from specific species populations, specific sites, to allow wider impacts on those to be taken account of. So it's really accepting that many, it's allowing us, it gives us new tools to tackle the more dispersed causes of nature's loss, and they're really important. Most recently, just last year, we had the Planning and Infrastructure Act, and these introduced some really important new things. And I'm not going to pretend these aren't controversial; they are. But I'll perhaps just discuss a few of these measures that come out of that act. Firstly, they introduced the I won't say concept because we're busily working on them, but they bring into being, they provide the legal mechanism to create environmental delivery plans. These are plans that enable development-related activity. So a developer, for example, to discharge their environmental obligations, including some that would currently apply through the habitats regulations, which are our strongest regulations for nature, through contributing to a strategic plan for nature recovery, rather than taking account of the impact on a site-by-site basis. The benefits to developers is that it saves time and gives certainty to them in their decision when they're thinking about a particular development. They can know upfront that is going to be able to get through. The commitments there are quite profound. For some, it's about saying, right, upfront, I can do this, but I'm going to pay for measures that are going to be in place for 100 years. That's the longest, but there are some really meaty commitments associated with this. Currently, those are theme specific. So the first one will be for nutrients. That's the 100-year EDP requirement, and Great Crested News. They're large scale, they're sub-regional, but the plan is that they will cover all of England. We're starting off on theme specific ones. That's what the provisions in the bill, in the Act, allow for at the moment. But I think I know we're already beginning to think of how we will do multi-factor ones. At the moment, you can still do multiple things in one place, but it would be about layering on top of each other requirements from different EDPs. EDP levies are paid into is called a nature recovery levy, which are paid into a nature recovery fund, which Natural England will administer, just as we will be the ones to develop the EDPs and agree with government what that levy should be. And we're really excited as an organisation, with, I think, in an eyes wide sense of the word excited, so not naively. We know that there are a lot of risks associated with EDPs if we don't get them right, but by constructing the right plans, doing the right strategic spatial planning, we think that we can ensure a win for nature by spending the money within the EDP area in ways that deliver substantially more than is likely to be lost through developmental impacts. The Planning and Infrastructure Act also allows for, it also sets the ground for strategic development strategies. These are going to be sub-regional. The key difference, or the key amplification, if you like, is that these are very much integrated cross-sectoral plans. Those, as part of that integration, as set out in the Act, must take account of LNRSs. These are still things that we are expecting to come. They don't yet exist, and we're expecting consultations out on those very soon. And collectively, then, all I'm saying, capturing at the bottom there, is that these further signal that shift to landscape scale planning and from site-based compensation measures to that strategic plan level mitigation. So these are going to be really important tools, I think, to deliver some of the things that we'll be talking about later on today. My slides have stopped moving on, let's just see. Then the last bit of policy that I really wanted to talk about was the land use framework for England. This just came out last week. So I'll say a little bit more about that, because I suspect we're all still catching up on what this might mean for us. What this strategy does, this framework does, is to set out a range of visions for land use, and it is land use, not sea use, in 2030 and 2050. And it sets that out for that list of themes on the left-hand side for housing, for energy infrastructure, food production, nature recovery, resilient landscapes, landscapes for water, and communities. And it's quite high-level visions, as these things often are, but it knits all of those together. And applying these four principles around multifunctionality, right use in the right place, future-ready decisions, and adaptive by design, it aims to integrate all those things that we need, and then sets out a range of actions, as set out, summarized on the right. There are many more in the framework itself around consistent spatial planning, multifunctional spaces, making land digital, and so on. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a moment. It sets out the need for change, and it does that quite starkly. So the key ones for us, I think, are around these category B and category C changes. So what this is saying is that in category B's place, which represent 4% of land use, the land use framework is signaling a need for significant changes in farming practice to make them more compatible with environmental outcomes, such as field margins, such as restoring peat, such as species-rich grassland and agroforestry, and so on. And then in the category C, which is a bigger area, 6%, actually, this is where the peat restoration largely is. I think the other one I meant to change to agroforestry, but there are some aspects of peat that do fit in that first one, depending on the type of soil that is talked about, which is why it appears in two things. But this is a more extensive land use for nature and climate, and signalling the need for about 6% of England to change to that. So 6% of England is over 1 million hectares. That's the sort of scale that we're talking about in terms of the amount of change that will be needed, that is really taking is really a significant change for the country. And then, sorry, just to finish that off, category D is around 1% of land, which is in this framework identified as needed for renewable energy and other green energy changes. And category E, 1% again, is for urban growth. So all the growth, and I think it is important to remember that with the focus on housing growth, the amount of growth that we actually need in terms of land take is relatively low. So managing that land take is going to be really important. Here are some take-home messages. Perhaps now optimistically, well, perhaps you would expect a government framework of this nature to say that. It asserts that we have enough land to deliver everything that we need of it. It doesn't say we'll go to 100% food security, of course, that isn't the plan, but it does talk about being able to deliver current ambitions that we want of land with the land that we've got. But it stresses that we're using it really inefficiently. We're often doing the things in the wrong place. It recognises that different parts of England are better suited to different uses, and that we need to make sure that the right changes happen in the right places to maximise the benefits. That sounds obvious, but it is a big change, isn't it? What we're used to is places receiving a planning to do something. A landowner chooses to do something, and there are relatively few constraints according to do that, and often incentive to support that choice. What this is signalling is that some of those choices might be wrong. Some of those choices will be really important. It also emphasises integration. So spatial decisions by one sector often affect another. Again, perhaps that's obvious, but this is really saying we need to do this planning together. And again, that's what Bob talked about earlier. Let's bring different needs that we have of an area all together in the same place to make the right decisions. It makes a commitment by 2030 that some payments under countryside stewardship and relevant payments under the Sustainable Farming Initiative will be spatially targeted. That again will be a big change. At the moment, on a farm by farm basis, a farmer says what they would like to do, and provided it meets certain criteria, they are paid with public money to do that. What this is saying is that will be done differently in the future, and that will be a big deal, and something that we'll have to work closely with the farming community and other landowners to bring them with us. Landscape recovery, which is the biggest tier that supports land use change within agri-environment schemes, is already spatially prioritised, but it also hints that we might do that even more. And there are really big commitments on making all of this easier through making spatial data more available and interoperable and transparent, so that, for example, we have a lot more data on who owns which bit of land and what's being done with that land, what's being paid for on that land. So what we've got is levels of planning, lots of levels of planning. I'm conscious, I think I'm maybe slightly running out of time, but I'll speed up a little bit. But we've got national level, county, regional level, biodiversity development and site level as well. And a lot of incentives linked to this, a lot of ambition to try and draw this together in a way that does deliver better outcomes for nature. So lots there, but unfortunately, nature isn't that great at reading policies. And I think what's really important is just remembering what all of that needs to add up to is the change that nature needs to recover. So what is that? We know something about the scale, just circling back to these biodiversity commitments. So we are going to deliver a whole load of more habitat. We are going to find ways of meeting 30 by 30 commitments. That's what the government is committed to doing. but how that's delivered is really crucial. And in particular, I'm going to argue that nature needs big, messy spaces, in particular in lowland areas. We know the Lawton panel's mantra of more, bigger, better joined. The key ones in there were the better and the bigger part of it. Those were the key aspects of the Lawton Review. That was the big take-home message that he said. They were in a ranked hierarchy. A lot of people talk about the joined part, but as I'll say in a minute, that was the last on the hierarchy for a reason. So better is about creating the spaces, the niches that species need to support populations by doing that at the right scale. So here's a purple heathland. That Calluna, the purple plant that we're looking at, Calluna vulgaris, is only used by about 10% of heathland species. So that isn't a brilliant heathland for many species. What a lot of species need in a heathland is messiness. They need bare patches of land. They need the wet patches. They need the scrub. They need spaces that support transitions and the different stages of their life cycle. So messiness is really good in nature. How big do sites need? Well, what some of the work that we've done since the Lawton Review have helped to clarify that, and we think that the evidence, and it's patchy evidence, we need to improve this, but around 20 to 40 hectares is pretty good for a fairly immobile target species such as a plant or some invertebrate species. More mobile target species, particular birds, and so on, can get by with about 100 hectares, probably a bit larger than that is what they need as a minimum stage. And what I'm really talking about here is enough space for to support a population that can grow. So with enough diversity, with enough aspects of what they need in their lifestyle, in their life cycle, to complete a life cycle and for a population to grow. If we're looking at multi-species solutions and delivering ecosystem services, we're really talking about much bigger places, perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 even hectares for resilient dynamic natural systems. So that's what we need. In fact, what we've got is an awful lot of tiny spaces. So I won't read it out, but median patch size for many of our important habitats is tiny. Even if we take the jewels in our crown, our triple SIs, over 75% of them are smaller than 100 hectares. More than 50% are smaller than 20 hectares. Around 15 hectares is the median size of a triple SIs. Most habitat patches in agri-environment schemes are even smaller. So what we've been doing through nature conservation for the last, certainly my whole career, isn't to deliver often the core sites that are needed to drive networks. They're delivering stepping stones or softening the matrix through which species that are probably doing already well can move. So if you like to use a power station analogy, we've been building the wiring, but not the power stations needed to drive nature networks. When we get those power stations, such as this Super National Nature Reserve at Purbeck, what we can do is to begin to up the scale of of the way we manage it. So this creating this much bigger space, it's about 2,500 hectares, has allowed the partners that include National Trust, RSPB, ourselves, and Forestry Commission to do radical things like bring in mixed herds of cattle. Bulls create bull pits, and they scrabble around. They create messiness. They're fantastic ecosystem engineers, and it allows us to really to go back to working with natural processes much more than trying to garden for nature, and can let nature get on with it and be a lot less precious about it. Connectivity, of course, does matter. But what we, and it is important to think about metapopulations as we do our spatial planning, but there are different ways of joining up sites. We can create stepping stones, we can create corridors, but very few species follow corridors. Or we can create permeable landscapes to allow species to move through. And we know that species do need to be able to move. But what we have too few of are the growing populations that would benefit from those connections. The red squirrel there is to remind me that not all species benefit from connectivity. Red squirrel populations, until we get on top of the greys, do need a degree of isolation to protect them from that. And species vary massively in how far they can move and what features of the landscape help them do so or act as barriers. And nature needs this different mix of connectivity features out there. As an example, just to probably overlabor this point, you all, I'm sure, know about the NEP Wildland project. The NEP is now the largest population of purple emperor butterflies in the country. Not far away from it is South Water Wood, which used to have the largest population. So these two really important populations of purple emperor are there in West Sussex. If you look at the recent distribution of purple emperor butterflies, they're cropping up all over the place around West Sussex. That has very little to do, I believe, to what's happening in between those sites. What's happening is NEP and South Water Wood have become these purple emperor engines that are chucking out loads of butterflies, and they are turning up. So if we can create enough places with expanding populations that create the dispersing pressure, either with individuals or their gametes, propagules, seeds, and so on, that is what will colonize the network. And this is what we have too few of in England. So that, I really hope, is what we keep hold of as we do our systematic planning. We need more battery packs and power stations in the nature recovery network, not just connections. So just a few final reflections. Don't take anything for granted. I mean, how dare they, the Daily Telegraph? We need to remember that that the case for nature, although people keep saying is popular, is still sometimes being challenged. We're seeing a shift from planning to strategic scale, integrating across sectors. We still don't know how to do that very well, and that's what this conference is about. We certainly need to make use of our land and seas far more efficiently if we're going to get what we need and fulfill that ambition set out in the land use framework. We've got a plethora of planning policies, but they do kind of make sense when you add them up. Mostly they're complementary at different scales. And we have increasing delivery mechanisms, such as the Nature Recovery Fund, and increasingly we think agri-environment schemes will be used to target the ambitions captured in the spatial plans that are being delivered. Nature does need more large, messy spaces in particular, especially in lowland England. And I think if we delivered on those, that would give another benefit, because although we're struggling to make the case for nature, what those places deliver is our fabulous, big, wild, exciting spaces that make the case for nature themselves. It allows nature to speak for themselves and allows communities to say, I'd like more of this, please. And in doing so, we also need to bring nature to people in their towns where they live. And my final point is that when we do this, if decisions jar with local communities, they totally jar with landowners, they're unlikely to succeed. We need to find a way of bringing people with us on this journey. I will stop there. I'm sorry if I've gone a little over.
That was brilliant, Pete. Thank you so much. Yeah, a fantastic scene setting, and yeah, it's really helpful to know where we are in terms of the sort of the new policies and legislation, a lot of which are very exciting, a lot of which that increased focus on spatial elements is brilliant. So yes, this is definitely shows why the SNAP community is important.